The winter of 1886 would be remembered across the Wyoming Territory as the one that broke ranchers, froze rivers solid to their beds, and buried the open range under drifts taller than a man on horseback. But in the small town of Larkspur Hollow, it would be remembered for something else entirely. The schoolteacher who gave up the only piece of gold she owned so that her neighbors might live to see the thaw. Theodora Holloway had never considered herself a woman of great courage. She taught letters and sums to the children of ranchers and shopkeepers in a one-room schoolhouse at the edge of town. She attended church every Sunday in her mother's mended blue dress, and she waited, as so many women of the frontier waited, for a man to come home. That man was Joel Yates, a cattle rancher with sun-browned hands and a laugh that carried across a corral. And in October of that year, standing beneath the cottonwood tree behind her aunt's house, he had slipped a slender gold band onto her finger and promised her that by the time the first snow fell, he would be back from the cattle drive to Cheyenne with enough money from the sale of his herd to build them a proper house with a stove that did not smoke and a bed frame that did not creak. "It was my mother's ring," Joel had told her, turning it gently on her finger as though checking that it fit, though he had already had it sized twice by the blacksmith to be certain. She wore it 30 years before she passed, through droughts and blizzards and one particularly ornery bull that near killed my father. I figure if it survived all that, it ought to survive us just fine. Theodora had laughed, the sound catching on the cold October wind, and pressed her palm against his rough cheek. "We are not going to be ornery, Joel Yates. Speak for yourself, Theodora Holloway." He had kissed her then, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that made promises without needing words, and she had believed, with the whole unguarded faith of a woman 24 years old and in love for the first time, that nothing in this wide gray territory could keep them apart. She did not yet know how wrong the sky could prove a person. Larkspur Hollow sat in a shallow valley along a nameless creek that fed into the Powder River, a town of perhaps 200 souls scattered among a general store, a church with a bell that had been hauled all the way from St. Louis, a schoolhouse, a blacksmith's forge, and a scattering of clapboard houses and sod-roofed cabins that leaned into the wind like old men leaning on canes. It was cattle country, hard and beautiful, the kind of land that could kill a man with its beauty as easily as with its cruelty. And in the autumn of 1886 it looked, for a little while, like an ordinary year. The grass had grown tall through summer. The ranchers had let their herds fatten on it without much thought to what winter might bring. And when Joel Yates and a dozen other men set out in October to drive 3,000 head to the railhead at Cheyenne, nobody in Larkspur Hollow imagined that the sky itself was gathering something terrible. Theodora stood at the edge of town on the morning Joel left, wrapped in her aunt's shawl against the October chill, and watched him swing up onto his horse, a rangy bay gelding named Ulysses that had carried him through worse trails than this one. "I will be back before the first snow," Joel called to her, and he believed it, the way a young man believes most things he says with conviction. "We will be married before Christmas, Theodora, I promise you that." "See that you are," she called back, though her voice wavered more than she wanted it to. "I have already told the Reverend Carter to expect us." He laughed, tipped his hat, and rode off at the head of the herd with the dust rising gold behind him in the low autumn light, and Theodora stood there long after the last steer had disappeared over the ridge, her hand pressed to the ring at her breast, until her Aunt Prudence came and gently steered her back toward the house. "He will come home," Prudence said, a widow herself these 11 years, who understood better than most what it meant to watch a man ride away and wonder. Men like Joel Yates always come home. Theodora wanted very much to believe that, and for a while she did. The first sign that something was wrong came in early November, when the sky over Larkspur Hollow turned the color of a bruise, and the wind shifted out of the north with a bite that had no business arriving so early in the season. The old-timers in town, men who had weathered range winters going back to the days before the railroad, muttered about it in low voices outside the general store, and Otis Grant, who owned that store and had a face permanently creased from decades of squinting at ledgers, began quietly rationing his flour before anyone had even asked him to. "It is coming early this year," he told Theodora when she stopped in to buy chalk for her students' slates. "Feel it in my knee before I feel it in the wind." "This is going to be a hard one." "How hard?" Theodora asked, though something in his face told her she did not want the answer. "Hard enough that I would not want to be a man driving cattle to Cheyenne right about now," Otis said, and then, seeing her face go pale, added quickly, "Now, I do not mean anything by that, Miss Holloway. Joel Yates is as capable a rancher as I have ever known. He will find shelter if he needs it." But the words did little to comfort her, and that night, lying awake in the small room she shared with her aunt, Theodora listened to the wind howl against the shutters and prayed, for the first time in her life, with the kind of desperate specificity that comes only from real fear. "Keep him safe. Keep him warm. Bring him home to me." The blizzard that struck the Powder River country in the second week of November was, by every account later given, one of the worst that anyone living had ever seen. It came down out of Canada in a wall of white that swallowed whole herds of cattle standing in open pasture, froze rivers so thick that wagons could cross them, and dropped temperatures to numbers that men would later argue about around stoves for the rest of their lives, some claiming it reached 40 below, others insisting it had gone lower still. Telegraph lines that connected the small ranching towns to the wider world snapped under the weight of ice and were not repaired for weeks. The trains that ran the Union Pacific Line, upon which towns like Larkspur Hollow depended for flour, sugar, coal, and news of the outside world, found their tracks buried under drifts 20 feet deep in places, and service that should have run twice weekly through the winter months slowed first to a trickle, and then, in the worst weeks of December, stopped entirely. Joel Yates and his men, driving 3,000 head of cattle across open range with no fences to guide them and no shelter but their bedrolls and a scattering of lined shacks, were caught squarely in the storm's path. They made it in the end to a line camp belonging to a rancher named Cyrus Bell, some 60 miles south of Larkspur Hollow and 40 miles shy of the railhead at Cheyenne, a squat one-room cabin with a sod roof that had been built to shelter 2 men through calving season, not a dozen cowhands stranded by the worst blizzard in living memory. They lost cattle, dozens of head at first, and then, as the weeks wore on and the snow kept coming in wave after relentless wave, hundreds, the animals drifting downwind of the storm until they piled up against fence lines and coulees and simply froze where they stood, unable to find grass beneath the ice. Joel Yates spent that winter in a cramped, smoke-stained cabin with 11 other men, rationing coffee and salt pork, watching his herd disappear into the white, and thinking, every single night before sleep took him, of Theodora Holloway standing at the edge of town with his mother's ring on her finger, waiting for a wedding that was not going to happen before Christmas after all. There was no way to send word. The trails south to Cheyenne and north to Larkspur Hollow were both buried under snow that could swallow a horse whole, and even if a man had been foolish enough to try to ride out, the temperature alone would have killed him within an hour of leaving shelter. So Joel Yates did the only thing he could do. He survived, and he waited, and he told himself over and over through the long dark months that Theodora would understand, that she would know he had not simply abandoned her, that the storm which had trapped him had surely reached Larkspur Hollow too, and she would have to know, that this was the sky's doing and not his own failure of promise. He did not know, could not know, what that same storm was doing to the town he had left her in. The trouble in Larkspur Hollow did not announce itself all at once. It came the way most hardships come to small towns, in small increments that seemed manageable on their own, but which, added together, formed a weight that threatened to crush everyone beneath it. The harvest that autumn had been thin, the corn stunted by a dry August that nobody had thought much about at the time, The cattle that ranchers had planned to sell for winter money were, most of them, out on the open range with the drives, either sold already at Cheyenne or, in the case of Joel Yates' herd and several others, stranded and dying in the same storm that had trapped their owners. And with the trains stopped, the flour and sugar and coal that Otis Grant's store depended on simply stopped arriving. By the first week of December, Otis Grant had begun keeping a ledger of debts that he knew, in his private heart, he would likely never collect, extending credit to families who had nothing left to trade and nowhere else to turn. By the second week, he had started rationing what remained of his flour to half a sack per family, then a quarter, and the children in Theodora's schoolhouse began arriving with thinner faces and slower hands, unable to hold their chalk steady in the cold because they had not eaten enough to keep their blood warm. It was Sarah Mills who first made Theodora understand how bad things had truly become. Sarah was a widow with 3 children, her husband having died the previous spring in a riding accident, and she had been managing barely on what little her husband had left her and what work she could take in mending clothes for other families. But mending work dried up when nobody had money to pay for it, and by mid-December, Sarah Mills came to the schoolhouse not to collect her children but to ask Theodora, in a voice stripped bare of pride, whether the school might have any extra bread from the noon meal the older students sometimes brought. "I would not ask," Sarah said, standing in the doorway with snow melting in her hair, "except that Daniel has not eaten a proper meal in 2 days, and Mary is so weak she can barely stand for her chores." Theodora gave her the bread she had brought for her own dinner without a second thought, and that night, walking home through streets buried in snow, past houses with thin curls of smoke rising from chimneys that could not afford to burn coal freely, she understood with sudden and terrible clarity that Larkspur Hollow was not simply enduring a hard winter. It was starving. She went to Otis Grant the next morning, before the sun had properly cleared the ridge line, and found him already at his ledgers, his breath visible in the cold store despite the small stove burning in the corner. "I need to know the truth, Otis," she said, without preamble, because there was no time left for the soft courtesies that usually governed conversation in Larkspur Hollow. "How bad is it?" Otis Grant set down his pencil and looked at her for a long moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice had none of its usual dry humor. "Bad, Miss Holloway, worse than bad. I have got maybe 3 weeks of flour left if I ration it hard, less sugar than that, no coal coming until the trains run again, and no word on when that will be. Doc Abernathy tells me he is nearly out of quinine and laudanum both, and with children as weak as they are getting, that worries me more than the flour does. We have got families in this town who have not had a proper meal in a week. What can be done? Not much, unless somebody in this town has got money nobody knows about, or the trains start running again inside the month, or God himself decides to melt this snow early." Otis rubbed a hand over his tired eyes. "I have extended credit until I am extending nothing but paper promises. I cannot conjure flour out of an empty sack, Miss Holloway, no matter how much I might wish to." Theodora walked home that day with her mind working through every possibility she could think of, and it was not until she was standing in her aunt's small kitchen, warming her hands over the stove, that her eyes fell upon her own hand, upon the slender gold band that Joel Yates had placed there in October, and an idea took root in her that she could not, once planted, uproot again. She turned the ring on her finger the way Joel had done that autumn afternoon, feeling its weight, its warmth from her own skin, and she thought of his mother wearing it through 30 years of droughts and blizzards, and she thought of the children in her schoolhouse with their thin faces and trembling hands, and she thought with a clarity that frightened her, that a ring, however precious, however dear, was still only gold, and gold could be turned into flour, and flour could keep children breathing until spring. She did not sleep that night. She lay beside her Aunt Prudence in the narrow bed they shared for warmth and turned the idea over and over, examining it from every angle, searching for some other way, some path that did not require her to give up the last physical piece of Joel she had left to hold onto while he was gone. But by morning, when the light came thin and gray through the frosted window, she had made her decision, and she dressed with a steadiness of purpose that surprised even herself. She found Otis Grant alone in his store, as she had hoped, and she set the ring on the wooden counter between them before her courage could fail her. "I want to sell this," she said. Otis Grant looked at the ring and then at her face, and understanding passed over his features slowly, followed by something that looked almost like pain. "Miss Holloway, that is your wedding ring, Joel Yates' mother's ring. I cannot take that from you." "You are not taking anything from me, Otis. I am selling it to you or through you, however it needs to be done. I know you have connections still, men who travel to Cheyenne when the roads permit, traders who come through even in hard winters looking for goods to carry east. That ring is gold, real gold, worth more than paper credit. It could buy flour, sugar, medicine, coal. It could feed this town until spring." "And what will you tell Joel when he comes home and finds his mother's ring gone from your finger?" Theodora had not let herself think that far ahead, not truly, not in any way that felt solid enough to hold. She swallowed hard and said, "I will tell him the truth, when the time comes, that his ring fed his neighbors through the hardest winter this territory has ever seen. I do not believe Joel Yates is a man who would rather see children starve than see me wear his mother's gold. But that is a conversation for spring, Otis, not for today. Today I need you to help me turn this into food." Otis Grant was quiet for a long moment, turning the ring over in his weathered fingers, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "There is a trader, Silas Crane, comes through here twice a winter if the weather allows, buys and sells goods between here and Cheyenne on pack horses when the trains cannot run. He was through 3 days past, said he would be back this way again before Christmas if the passes stayed clear enough. He deals in gold as readily as he deals in furs. I could get you a fair price, Miss Holloway, fairer than most, because I would make certain of it myself. Then that is what we will do. Does your aunt know what you intend?" "No," Theodora said. "And I would ask that you not tell her, not yet. Not tell anyone, in fact, where the money for this winter's supplies has truly come from. Let them think it is credit, or charity from somewhere else, or anything at all besides the truth. I do not want anyone's pity, and I most especially do not want word reaching Joel before I can tell him myself, whenever he finally does come home." Otis Grant studied her for a long moment, and something in his weathered face softened into something like respect. "You are a braver woman than most men I have known, Miss Holloway. I will keep your secret. And I will make certain that ring buys every ounce of flour and sugar and medicine that Silas Crane's pack horses can carry." Silas Crane arrived in Larkspur Hollow 4 days before Christmas, driving 3 heavily laden pack horses through snow that came up past their knees, his beard crusted with ice and his voice hoarse from the cold. And when Otis Grant showed him the ring in the back room of the general store, away from prying eyes, the trader turned it over in the lamplight and let out a low whistle. "Fine piece of gold, this. Old work, too, not the thin stuff they are stamping out these days. I could get a good price for this in Cheyenne, better than most anything else I am likely to trade for this side of the mountains. I want a fair price, Silas, not the price you would offer a desperate man," Otis said. "This town is depending on it." Silas Crane, who for all his rough trader's manner had lived long enough in hard country to understand exactly what desperation looked like, named a price that made even Otis Grant's eyebrows rise, and when Otis relayed the sum to Theodora that evening, she had to sit down on a barrel of nails to steady herself. "That much, and Silas Crane is not a man known for generosity." "That ring was worth more than either of us guessed, Miss Holloway. It is enough to buy flour and sugar and coal and medicine both, if we spend it wisely, enough to see this town through to spring with some room to spare." Theodora pressed her hand to her mouth, torn between grief for what she had given up and fierce, blazing relief for what it would now buy, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Then let us spend it wisely, Otis. Every penny of it." What followed was, by Theodora's own later account, the hardest and most meaningful work she had ever undertaken. Silas Crane agreed, for a further fee paid in coin from the ring's sale, to make one more supply run to Cheyenne and back before the deepest cold of January set in, and Otis Grant drew up careful lists of what the town needed most. Flour first, then sugar and salt, coal for the families who had none, and as much of Doc Abernathy's medicine as the apothecary in Cheyenne could spare, quinine and laudanum and the ingredients for poultices, because a coughing sickness had begun moving through the town's youngest and oldest, and Doc Abernathy had confided to Theodora, in a private moment outside his surgery, that without medicine, he expected to lose at least 3 of his current patients before. The month was through. The journey itself nearly ended in disaster. Silas Crane set out with his pack horses in the last week of December, following the frozen bed of the creek south toward the main road to Cheyenne, because the drifts made the road itself impassable. And halfway through the second day, one of his pack horses broke through a patch of ice that had looked solid over what should have been shallow water, but which concealed, beneath its frozen surface, a deeper channel where the current had kept the water from freezing all the way through. The horse went down hard, thrashing, and Silas Crane, working alone with no one to help him, spent nearly an hour in bitter cold pulling the terrified animal free before it succumbed to the water's pull, losing half his supply of coal in the process when the pack came loose and sank. He arrived back in Larkspur Hollow 3 days later than expected, half his fingers frostbitten, his voice barely a whisper from the cold he had endured, but he had made it. And when Otis Grant and Theodora unloaded the pack horses in the back room of the general store, counting sacks of flour and tins of medicine by lantern light, Theodora found herself weeping, quietly and without shame, for the first time since Joel Yates had ridden away in October. "It is enough," Otis Grant said, running his hands over the supplies with something like reverence. "It is enough to see us through, Miss Holloway. You have saved this town." "We have saved this town," Theodora corrected him. "You and Silas Crane and every family who has shared what little they had left with their neighbors. I only provided the means." But Otis Grant only shook his head, and from that day forward, though he kept his promise never to speak of the ring itself, there was a new gentleness in the way he looked at Theodora Holloway, a quiet gratitude that ran deeper than words. Christmas came to Larkspur Hollow that year not with abundance but with something perhaps more valuable: enough. Enough flour for bread, enough sugar for a small sweetness in the children's cups, enough coal to keep the church warm for the Christmas Eve service that Reverend Michael Carter led by lamplight, his breath still visible in the cold despite the stove's best efforts. The town gathered that night in a way it perhaps never had before. Families who had spent the autumn arguing over property lines and grazing rights, now sitting shoulder to shoulder on hard wooden pews, sharing what little they had, singing hymns with voices made thin by hunger but strong with something like hope. Theodora sat beside her Aunt Prudence, her bare finger tucked into the folds of her shawl where no one would notice its absence, and when Reverend Carter spoke of gifts given not from abundance but from the heart, she thought of Joel Yates somewhere out in the white unknown, and she prayed silently that wherever he was warm and safe, and that he would forgive her, when the time came, for the choice she had made. The coughing sickness that Doc Abernathy had feared did claim one life that winter, an elderly widower named Thomas Whitfield, who had been weak already from age, and had not the strength to fight off the illness even with medicine. And the town mourned him properly, burying him in a grave dug with great difficulty through frozen ground. But Doc Abernathy told Theodora privately, some weeks later, that without the quinine and laudanum that Silas Crane's pack horses had carried back from Cheyenne, He believed the sickness would have claimed at least 3 more, likely 4, including Sarah Mills's youngest daughter, Mary, who had been so weak by the second week of January that Doc Abernathy had feared for her through 3 consecutive nights. "That child is alive today because of medicine this town would not have had without you, Miss Holloway," Doc Abernathy told her, standing outside his surgery in the pale light of a January afternoon. "I do not know what arrangement you made to get it, and Otis Grant will not say, but I know enough to understand that it cost you something dear." "It cost me a ring, doctor, not a child's life. I made the better trade, and I do not regret it, not for one moment." "No," Doc Abernathy said, studying her with the same quiet respect that had begun to spread through the town like a warmth of its own. "I do not suppose you do." The winter ground on, brutal and unrelenting, through January and into February, and Theodora Holloway continued teaching her students each morning in a schoolhouse kept just warm enough by the coal her sacrifice had purchased, continued visiting families with baskets of flour and sugar that Otis Grant quietly restocked whenever the supplies ran low, continued, through every long cold night, to wonder where Joel Yates was, and whether he was thinking of her the way she thought of him. With a longing that had grown, if anything, sharper and more desperate with every week that passed without word. She was not the only one whose thoughts turned constantly southward. Down at Cyrus Bell's line camp, 60 miles from Larkspur Hollow, Joel Yates spent that same winter in conditions nearly as harsh as the town he had left behind, though he did not know it, and his thoughts, too, turned constantly northward, toward a woman he had promised to marry before Christmas and had failed to return to. The 12 men trapped in that small line camp survived on salt pork, hardtack, and whatever coffee remained, rationed carefully by Cyrus Bell, who had weathered enough winters on the open range to know exactly how thin their margins had become. They lost cattle daily at first, then in great drifts of frozen bodies that piled against the coulees like snow itself, until by February, Joel Yates estimated that of the 3,000 head he had set out with in October, perhaps a third remained alive, thin and weak, pawing through crusted snow in search of grass that simply was not there. "This winter is going to be talked about for 50 years, Cyrus Bell said one evening. The 12 men crowded around the small stove in a silence broken only by the wind outside and the occasional distant, mournful sound of cattle dying in the dark. "I have never seen anything like it, and I have been on this range since before the war. What happens when the money from the herd does not cover what we lost?" one of the younger cowhands asked, voicing the fear that had been sitting unspoken in every man's chest for weeks. "Then we start again," Cyrus Bell said simply. "That is what a man does out here. He starts again." Joel Yates said little during these exchanges, his mind occupied instead with calculations of a different sort. How many days since he had left Larkspur Hollow? How many days past the wedding he had promised? How Theodora must be faring in a winter that he knew, from the drifts piling against Cyrus Bell's cabin walls, must be striking the town just as hard as it was striking this remote camp. He tried in his mind to picture her safe and warm in her aunt's small house, surrounded by enough food and enough fuel to see her through, but the pictures felt thin and unconvincing, haunted by an anxiety he could not shake. "You are thinking about that schoolteacher of yours again," Cyrus Bell observed one night, not unkindly, as the 2 men sat up later than the others, watching the stove's dying embers. "I promised her I would be home before Christmas," Joel said. "It is February now, Cyrus. She must think I have abandoned her. Or worse, she must be sitting there wondering if I am dead in a snowdrift somewhere, and there is nothing I can do to tell her otherwise." "There is nothing any of us can do, son. Not until this snow lets up enough to move. You ride out into this, you are dead inside an hour, and then that girl really will have something to grieve. Best thing you can do for Theodora Holloway right now is stay alive and get yourself home to her whole, whenever the weather finally allows it." Joel knew Cyrus Bell was right, knew it with the cold, logical part of his mind that had kept him alive through every hard winter he had weathered on the range before this one. But knowing it did nothing to ease the ache that sat in his chest every single night, the fear that something might happen to Theodora while he sat helpless, 60 miles away, unable even to send word that he was alive. It was not until the first week of March that the weather finally broke enough to allow travel, the temperatures climbing above freezing for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the snow beginning its slow, grudging retreat from the land it had claimed since November. Cyrus Bell counted what remained of the herd scattered across his range, a grim tally that confirmed losses no rancher in the territory would forget for a generation, and the 12 men who had weathered the winter together in that cramped line camp began, at last, to make preparations to travel, some south to Cheyenne to salvage what business they could, others north, back toward the towns and families they had left behind in October. Joel Yates was among the first to saddle his horse. "You be careful," Cyrus Bell told him, gripping his hand in a firm parting shake. "The thaw brings its own dangers, rivers running high, ice breaking up under a horse's feet before you know it is gone. Do not let 6 months of surviving this winter go to waste by being careless in the last 60 miles. I have survived worse to get to less important things," Joel said, swinging up onto Ulysses, who had, remarkably, weathered the winter better than many of the other horses, kept alive on grain that Joel had shared from his own meager rations. "I am not dying 60 miles from Theodora Holloway, Cyrus, not after everything." The journey north took him 4 days, through mud and slush and rivers running high and fast with snowmelt, past the frozen carcasses of cattle scattered across the range like some terrible testament to the winter's cruelty. And with every mile, his anxiety grew rather than eased, because the closer he drew to Larkspur Hollow, the more he began to understand, from the desolation he passed through, just how hard this winter must have struck the town itself. He crested the ridge above Larkspur Hollow on a gray afternoon in early March, his beard grown thick and unkempt, his coat threadbare and his boots soaked through, and looked down at the town for a long moment before urging Ulysses forward, his heart hammering with a fear he could not quite name, a fear that had less to do with what he might find and more to do with what he might have lost. The town, when he rode into it, looked thinner than he remembered, the winter having clearly taken its toll on buildings and people alike. But it was, unmistakably, still standing, smoke rising from chimneys, children's voices calling somewhere near the schoolhouse, and Joel Yates felt a relief so profound it nearly buckled his knees right there in the saddle. He found Theodora Holloway standing outside the schoolhouse, dismissing her students for the day, her breath visible in the cool March air, her hair coming loose from its pins in a way that struck him, even after 6 months apart, as achingly familiar. And when she turned and saw him standing there, road-worn and thin and very much alive, she made a sound that was not quite a word and ran to him across the muddy street with no regard at all for propriety or dignity. And he swung down from Ulysses just in time to catch her. "You are alive," she said over and over, her hands moving over his face, his shoulders, as though she needed to confirm with her fingers what her eyes were already telling her. "Joel, you are alive, you are here, I thought. I did not know what to think, I prayed every night, I am here," he said, holding her face between his cold hands, his own eyes bright with tears he made no effort to hide. "I am so sorry, Theodora, I am so sorry it took so long. The storm caught us before we reached Cheyenne, we lost most of the herd, we were snowed into a line camp with no way to send word. I thought of you every single day, I promise you that every single day I thought of nothing else but getting back to you." "I know," she said, and she was laughing now even as she cried, the sound of it wild and joyful in the cold spring air. "I know, Joel, you are here now, that is all that matters. You are here." He kissed her then in the middle of the muddy street with half the town's children watching and giggling from the schoolhouse steps, and it was only when he pulled back, still holding her face in his hands, that his eyes fell upon her bare left hand and his brow furrowed in confusion. "Theodora," he said slowly, "where is your ring?" She felt the question land like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward through the easy joy of their reunion. And for a moment she considered, seriously considered, telling him some small lie that she had misplaced it, that it was safe at home tucked into a drawer, that she would explain everything once they were alone and had time to talk properly. But looking into his face, into the open, trusting concern in his eyes, she found she could not do it. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to let me finish before you say anything because it is not a simple thing to explain, and I do not regret it, not for one moment, no matter what you think of me once you hear it." Joel Yates' confusion deepened into something more serious, but he nodded slowly. "Tell me." They walked together, not to her aunt's house but to the small bench outside the church where they had first courted 2 summers before. And there, with the March wind stirring around them and the last patches of dirty snow still clinging to the shadowed corners of the town, Theodora Holloway told Joel Yates everything. The early storm, the failed harvest, the trains that stopped running, Otis Grant's dwindling supplies, Sarah Mills's hungry children, Doc Abernathy's warning about the coughing sickness and the medicine he could not obtain, and finally her decision, made alone in the dark of a December night, to sell the ring his mother had worn for 30 years so that the town might have flour and sugar and coal and medicine enough to survive until spring. "I sold it to Otis Grant, who sold it through a trader to Cheyenne," she said, her voice steady even as her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "It bought enough to see this whole town through the winter, Joel. Sarah Mills's children did not go hungry. Mary Mills, who nearly died of the coughing sickness in January, is alive today because of the medicine that money bought. I know it was your mother's ring, I know what it meant, what it should have meant to me too, and I understand if you cannot forgive me for Theodora." His voice cut through her explanation, rough with an emotion she could not immediately identify, and when she looked up at him, afraid of what she might see, she found not anger in his face but something closer to awe. "You are not angry with me." Angry. He took her bare hand in both of his, turning it over gently, tracing the place where the ring had once sat with his thumb. "Theodora, I spent this whole winter terrified that I would come home and find this town in ruins, find people I have known my whole life dead or scattered, and instead I come home to find that you held it together. You fed children with my mother's ring. You saved lives with it. I cannot think of a single thing my mother would have wanted more from that gold than exactly what you did with it. Truly, truly." He pressed a kiss to her bare knuckles, his eyes bright. "My mother buried 2 children before I was born, Theodora, lost to a diphtheria outbreak that swept through this territory before the war. She used to tell me that gold sitting idle in a drawer had never saved a single life, and she was right about that. You did exactly what she would have wanted done with it. I am not angry. I am prouder of you than I have words to say." Theodora let out a breath she felt she had been holding since December, and the tears she had been holding back finally fell, though now they were tears of relief rather than fear. "I was so afraid you would see it as a betrayal, as me giving away something you gave me. You did not give it away, Theodora. You put it to exactly the use my mother would have chosen if she had been the one facing that winter instead of you." He wiped her tears with a gentleness that undid her completely. "Though I confess, I do intend to see about getting it back if it can be managed. Not because I think less of what you did, but because I would like my children someday to wear that ring and know the story of the winter their mother sold it to save a town. Otis Grant will know where the trader took it. Sela's Crane deals mostly with a jeweler in Cheyenne, if it has not already been sold on from there. Then we will ask him," Joel said, "though it can wait a few days yet. Right now, I have missed 6 months of your company, and I do not intend to spend a single hour of my first day home talking business with Otis Grant." Word of what Theodora Holloway had done spread through Larkspur Hollow within days of Joel's return, not because Theodora herself spoke of it, but because Sarah Mills, Upon learning the truth from an overheard conversation between Otis Grant and Doc Abernathy, could not contain her gratitude and told half the town herself, weeping as she did so, declaring to anyone who would listen that Theodora Holloway had saved her children's lives at the cost of her own wedding ring, and asking nothing in return. The town's response was, in its way, as moving as the sacrifice itself. Families who had received flour or medicine through that hard winter began arriving at the small house Theodora shared with her aunt, bringing what little they could spare in return. A jar of preserves saved back from the previous summer, a hand-knitted shawl, a chicken that a rancher's wife could ill afford to give up but insisted on giving anyway. Theodora tried to refuse these gifts, embarrassed by the attention and uncomfortable with being thanked for something she had done simply because it needed doing. But the townsfolk would not be dissuaded, and eventually she learned to accept their gratitude with the same grace she had shown in giving up the ring in the first place. Reverend Michael Carter spoke of her sacrifice from the pulpit that first Sunday after Joel's return, without naming her directly at first, speaking instead of the parable of the widow's mite, of gifts given not from abundance but from the whole of what a person has. And though he did not need to say her name for every soul in that congregation to know exactly whom he meant, Theodora sat through the sermon with her cheeks burning and her hand held tightly in Joel's beneath the pew, grateful beyond words that the man beside her had not turned from her but had, if anything, drawn closer. It was Otis Grant who finally provided the information Joel needed regarding the ring's whereabouts. Silas Crane, it turned out, had not sold the ring onward to a jeweler as expected, but had instead kept it himself, struck by something in its old, careful craftsmanship that made him reluctant to part with it for mere profit. And when word reached him through the trading network that connected small towns and larger settlements across the territory that the ring's original owner had returned home and might wish to reclaim it, Silas Crane sent word back through a passing rider that he would be willing to sell it back, at a fair price, whenever Joel Yates could make the journey to collect it. Joel rode to Cheyenne in the last week of March, using what money remained from the eventual sale of his surviving cattle, thinned dramatically by the winter's losses but still enough to salvage something from the disaster, and found Silas Crane at a trading post on the outskirts of the growing city, the ring still wrapped carefully in a small square of oiled cloth exactly as Otis Grant had first given it to him back in December. "Heard you came home safe," Silas Crane said, studying Joel with the assessing eye of a man who had traded with all sorts across the territory, "and heard what that ring bought while you were gone. Struck me as a story worth remembering, so I kept it back rather than passing it on. Figured a ring with a story like that ought to go home again, if the man it belonged to came looking." "I am obliged to you," Joel said, and meant it deeply, exchanging the agreed sum for the small cloth bundle with hands that trembled slightly, whether from the cold spring wind or from emotion, he could not have said. He rode back to Larkspur Hollow with the ring tucked safely inside his coat, close against his heart, and arrived on an evening in early April when the last of the winter's snow had finally melted from the valley floor, and the first green shoots of grass were pushing up through soil that had, for 6 long months, been frozen solid. He found Theodora in her aunt's kitchen garden, turning the soil with a hoe in preparation for spring planting, her sleeves rolled up and her hair loose around her shoulders in a way that struck him, as it always did, as more beautiful than any careful arrangement could have managed. And when she saw him standing at the garden gate, she set down the hoe and came to him without a word, reading something in his face that told her exactly what he had gone to Cheyenne to do. He knelt in the half-turned soil of her aunt's garden, the ring held between 2 fingers, and looked up at her with an expression that held 6 months of longing and worry and love all at once. "Theodora Holloway," he said, "I asked you to marry me back in October and life had other plans for us both. But I am asking you again properly here in the spring, with this ring that you gave away once to save this whole town and that I have brought home again because I cannot imagine a woman more worthy of wearing it. Will you marry me?" Theodora, laughing and crying in equal measure, sank down into the dirt beside him, heedless of her skirt, and took his face in both her hands. "Joel Yates, I would have married you in a flour sack if that was all either of us had left after this winter. Yes, yes, I will marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger there in the garden soil, and this time when he kissed her, there was no wind howling with the promise of a coming storm, only the soft, damp smell of spring earth and the distant sound of a robin calling from the branches of the cottonwood tree that had witnessed their first parting the previous autumn. They were married on the last Sunday of April, in a ceremony that the whole of Larkspur Hollow turned out to attend, crowding into the church and spilling out onto the muddy street beyond, because there was not a family in that town who had not, in some way, been touched by what Theodora Holloway had done to see them through the winter, and every one of them wanted to bear witness to her happiness now that spring had finally come. Reverend Michael Carter performed the ceremony with evident emotion, and when he came to the part of the service concerning the exchange of rings, he paused and looked out over the congregation before speaking. "This ring," he said, holding up the plain gold band for the gathered town to see, "was sold this past winter by the bride herself to buy food and medicine for this very congregation. It traveled to Cheyenne and back, passed through the hands of a trader who recognized its worth went beyond mere gold, and has now returned home, as have the man and woman it belongs to. I do not believe I have ever blessed a ring with more history behind it, nor a marriage more clearly built upon a foundation of sacrifice and love in equal measure." There was not a dry eye in the church by the time Joel Yates slid the ring back onto Theodora's finger for the second and final time, speaking his vows in a voice thick with emotion, and when Reverend Carter finally pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the congregation could be heard, according to old Otis Grant, clear down at the general store 3 streets away. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, held in the open space beside the schoolhouse where long tables had been set up laden with whatever the town could provide, a feast that would have seemed modest in a wealthier place, but which, to a town that had spent the winter counting every ounce of flour, felt like the richest banquet imaginable. Sarah Mills brought a cake she had saved sugar for weeks to bake, her children dancing barefoot in the new spring grass with a joy that made Theodora's throat tighten with happiness. Otis Grant brought out a bottle of good whiskey he had been saving for a special occasion, and declared, to general agreement, that no occasion in his memory had ever been more deserving of it. Doc Abernathy raised a toast to the bride that acknowledged, without needing to say too much, exactly what she had done for this town and what it had cost her, and Silas Crane, who had traveled back to Larkspur Hollow specifically for the wedding, having grown fond of the story he had played a small part in, presented the couple with a fine woolen blanket as a gift, declaring that a couple who had weathered a winter like that one deserved to stay warm for every winter after. Even members of a nearby Shoshone band, who had traded fairly and peacefully with Theodora that winter when she had gone with Otis Grant to exchange flour and coffee for warm furs and dried meat that helped stretch the town's dwindling supplies, sent word of congratulations through a young rider, along with a beautifully worked pair of beaded moccasins as a wedding gift, a gesture that Theodora received with deep gratitude, mindful, as she had been all winter, of how much her own people's presence on this land had cost the Shoshone, and how rare and precious such generosity truly was given all that history between them. She and Joel spoke often in the years that followed about the unfairness of a territory that had taken so much from the tribes who had lived there long before any rancher or homesteader arrived, and they made it a point, in their own dealings, to trade fairly and treat their native neighbors with the respect too rarely extended to them elsewhere in the territory. As the sun set on their wedding day, painting the sky above Larkspur Hollow in shades of gold and rose that seemed, to Theodora, like some final blessing on the long, hard road that had brought her and Joel to this moment. She stood beside her new husband and looked out over the town that had, in its own way, become as much a part of their love story as either of them. "Do you regret it?" Joel asked quietly, his arm around her waist as they watched the celebration continue around them. "Any of it. The ring, the winter, all of it." Theodora considered the question seriously, turning it over the way she had turned over so many hard decisions that winter, before she answered. "I regret that you had to spend 6 months not knowing if I was safe, and I regret every night you spent worrying about a wedding that was not happening the way we had planned. But the ring itself? No, Joel, I do not regret that at all. I would sell it again tomorrow if this town needed it, and I hope you know that about me, going forward. I am not a woman who will always choose the easy path when there is a harder, better one available." "I would not want a wife who chose otherwise," Joel said, pulling her closer. "I fell in love with a schoolteacher who has more courage than half the cowhands I rode with this winter, Theodora Holloway Yates. I do not intend to spend the rest of our marriage wishing you were softer or safer. I intend to spend it grateful, every single day, that you are exactly who you are." They built their life together in Larkspur Hollow over the years that followed, on a modest homestead just outside town, where Joel rebuilt his herd slowly and carefully, having learned hard lessons from the winter of 1886 about the dangers of overconfidence in open-range grazing, fencing off winter pasture and storing hay against future hardship in a way that few ranchers in the territory had yet adopted, but which spread, gradually, as word of that terrible winter's lessons traveled from ranch to ranch across the following years. Theodora continued teaching at the schoolhouse for several more years, until the arrival of their first child, a son they named Thomas after the elderly widower. The town had lost that hard winter, made the daily walk to the schoolhouse impractical, though she remained active in the town's affairs for the rest of her life, helping to establish, some years later, a proper relief fund that the town maintained thereafter against future hardships, so that no family in Larkspur Hollow would ever again have to depend on the sacrifice of a single ring to survive a bad winter. Thomas was followed, 2 years later, by a daughter they named Grace, and then, some years after that, by a second son, Michael, named for the Reverend Carter who had married them and who remained a close family friend until his passing many years later, an old man surrounded by a congregation that had grown to love him as deeply as he had loved them. Otis Grant lived long enough to see all three of the Yates children grow into adulthood, and he told the story of Theodora's ring to each of them in turn, embellishing it slightly more with each retelling, until the tale took on something of the flavor of a legend in Larkspur Hollow, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations for years to come. The story of the schoolteacher who had sold her wedding ring to feed a town through the hardest winter anyone could remember, and the cowboy who had come home in the spring to find that love, when it was real and deep enough, could survive any storm the sky chose to throw at it. Sarah Mills's children grew strong and healthy in the years that followed, Mary in particular going on to become a teacher herself, following in the path of the woman whose sacrifice had, quite literally, kept her alive through that terrible January fever, and she often told her own students in later years about the winter of the die-up and the courage it had drawn out of ordinary people doing extraordinary things simply because the need was there and someone had to answer it. Joel Yates never did forget the lesson that winter had taught him, and though his ranch prospered in the years that followed, growing into one of the more respected operations in that part of the territory, he never lost the habit of checking on his neighbors before a hard winter set in, of setting aside extra stores against lean years, of remembering that the land which gave so generously in good seasons could take just as ruthlessly in bad ones, and that a community which cared for its weakest members was a community that would endure whatever the sky chose to send against it. On winter evenings, when the snow fell soft and manageable against the windows of the house Joel had built for her, nothing like the terrible blizzards of that first year, Theodora would sometimes catch Joel looking at her hand, at the plain gold ring that had traveled to Cheyenne and back, that had fed a town and been returned home again, and she would see in his eyes the same expression he had worn kneeling in her aunt's garden that April afternoon. An expression of a love that had been tested by hardship and had come through not diminished but deepened, forged into something stronger than either of them could have imagined on that autumn day 2 years before when he had first placed his mother's ring on her finger and promised her a wedding before Christmas. "What are you thinking about?" she asked him once, catching him in just such a moment, their children asleep in the next room and the fire burning low and warm in the hearth. "I am thinking," Joel said, taking her hand and turning the ring gently the way he always did, "that I am the luckiest man in this territory, married to a woman who would rather feed a town than keep gold she did not truly need. I am thinking that my mother, wherever she is, must be very pleased with what became of her ring, and prouder still of the woman who wears it now." Theodora leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the fire, feeling the weight of the ring on her finger and the deeper, more permanent weight of a love that had survived the hardest winter the territory had ever known, and thought that, whatever hardships still lay ahead of them in the years to come, she and Joel Yates would face them exactly as they had faced that terrible winter of 1886. Together, with courage, and with a fierce, unshakable devotion to each other, and to the community that had, in its own way, brought them closer than any wedding vow alone could have managed. The story of Theodora Holloway's ring became, in time, simply another thread in the fabric of Larkspur Hollow's history, told alongside stories of droughts survived and floods weathered, and the slow, steady growth of a town that had, against considerable odds, managed to become something lasting on that hard and beautiful land. But for Theodora and Joel themselves, it remained something more personal than mere town legend. A reminder, worn every day on her left hand, of a winter that had tested them both to their limits and a love that had emerged from that testing not weakened but transformed, gold refined by fire into something that would last, as surely as the ring itself had lasted, through every season that followed, for the whole of their long and happy life together.